My name is Elena Thompson, and I'm 42 years old. I've spent most of my life being quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I learned early that silence is sometimes the strongest voice in the room. That Saturday afternoon, the sky over Charlottesville was a perfect shade of southern blue, clear calm, and deceivingly beautiful. My sister Grace was getting married on an estate that looked like it belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine. Manicured gardens, stone fountains, white peonies bursting open like secrets, and champagne flutes that never emptied. The guests were polished upper class and well-connected, Ivy League friends, politicians' daughters. Some guy from a venture capital firm who kept talking about private jets in Napa Valley like they were casual weekend plans. And me, I was seated at table 14, the last one in the far corner near the kitchen doors and the sound equipment. My table mates included a fidgety toddler, a forgetful great-aunt who called me Ellen, and a college roommate of Grace's I had never heard of until that morning. No one asked what I did for a living. No one introduced me. No one made room in their conversations for someone like me. I wore a simple navy blue dress. No rank, no medals, no makeup. Grace had specifically asked, "Please no uniform, Elena. I just want the wedding to feel light, not formal, not like some military memorial." I nodded. I wasn't surprised. I was used to making myself smaller so Grace could shine. And I thought I could do it again just for this one day, until the maid of honor gave her speech. She stepped up to the mic like she was on stage at a comedy club. Her voice sparkled with charm, the kind that grates if you know how fake it is. Grace has always been the sun in the room. She lights up everyone around her. And Elena, Grace's older sister, has always been the steady one. Always working, always so private. She works in, I think some government office in D.C. Honestly, I don't even know what she does. Some kind of clerk laughter. Light, polite, then a little too loud. People clinked glasses. Someone leaned over to whisper, "Is that true?" I took a slow sip of white wine. Not because I was angry, but because I'd heard it all before. In different words, at different tables, from different people. But this time something changed. Across the room, Andrew the groom froze. He was still holding his champagne, but his eyes had locked on me. His brows slowly knit together. His lips parted like he'd seen something. Or someone. He wasn't prepared for. He leaned over to his best man, someone in dress blues, clearly a fellow officer, and whispered something. The best man's head turned sharply in my direction. Then I saw it. The double take, the widening eyes, the barely concealed recognition. His mouth moved, though I couldn't hear what he said. But I knew the words. I had seen that look before, once in Kabul, once in Ramstein, and once in the Pentagon briefing room when I walked in, and a full-bird colonel jumped to attention before I could even remove my coat. Now that same look was spreading across the wedding hall like a slow-moving current. I turned away, not out of shame, but because I had no interest in stealing the moment, not yet. Let them whisper, let them wonder, let them remember what they said when they thought I was just a clerk. I didn't need to say a word. Not yet. Because this was the beginning. I was always the quiet one, the serious one, the daughter who didn't wear eyeliner, who preferred structure over spontaneity, who read books about military strategy instead of teenage romance. Growing up, I wasn't the child anyone bragged about at dinner parties. I was the one who set the table, got straight A's, and stayed out of trouble. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I genuinely believed that if I followed the rules, if I did everything right, maybe one day someone would see me. Maybe I'd finally matter. But that day never came. My mother used to say I was too intense. You don't have to be so strict all the time, Elena. Smile more. Be soft. Men like softness. I didn't have the natural charm that Grace had. Grace could flutter her eyelashes and ask for help with something she was perfectly capable of doing herself, and everyone adored her for it. She was sunshine in a bottle. I was the thunderstorm people hoped would pass quickly. By the time we hit our 20s, the differences between us weren't just emotional, they were structural. Grace went to Columbia, studied fashion marketing, interned in Manhattan, wore red lipstick that always looked flawless. I went to West Point. I still remember the look on my mother's face when I told her I'd been accepted. "That's nice," she said, blinking slowly. "But you'll be surrounded by men, Elena, and not the good kind." She never visited campus. Not once. My father sent me a card on my birthday that first year with $20 and a short note, "Proud of you, kiddo. Don't let them run you into the ground." But they didn't come to my graduation. I stood there in full dress uniform, silver bars, newly pinned to my shoulders, watching other cadets cry into their mother's arms and pose for pictures with their beaming families. My parents had RSVP'd. Maybe. They never followed up. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. Meanwhile, Grace became the golden girl. She landed a job at a boutique PR firm that catered to luxury brands. Our parents would tell anyone who'd listen that their youngest daughter worked in fashion and traveled to Paris at least twice a year. "She's doing so well for herself," my mother would beam. "She's really made it." If I was mentioned at all, it was vague. "Elena works in Washington. Some defense thing. She's very smart, but private." They never asked what I actually did. They never asked where I went, what I saw, or who I led. In Afghanistan, I commanded combat units through terrain so brutal it ate entire convoys. I made life-and-death decisions over satellite feeds while mortars fell just miles away. In Iraq, I oversaw intelligence operations that disrupted insurgent networks. And still to my family, I was the girl who worked with computers. Grace once asked if I could fix the Wi-Fi during a family dinner. I was a lieutenant colonel by then. I don't think they meant harm. They just couldn't see me. Maybe I didn't let them. Maybe I stopped trying. There's a strange kind of grief that comes with being invisible to the people who raised you. Not rejection, just erasure. A silent rewriting of who you are into something more comfortable for them to understand. They didn't know what to do with a woman like me. A woman who could command a room of uniformed men but couldn't fake interest in Pinterest boards or country club gossip. A woman who had faced down the worst of humanity in faraway lands but still got seated at the kids' table during Thanksgiving. And the saddest part, I accepted. I shrank myself to fit the space they gave me. Grace filled the room. And I fell. I filled the silence. Until the day came when the silence spoke for itself. The morning of the wedding, while Grace was having her hair curled and her lashes lifted, my mother pulled me aside near the staircase and lowered her voice like she was sharing a national secret. "Please don't wear your uniform today, Elena. This isn't a military ceremony, it's a wedding. I don't want people feeling tense. You understand, right?" I smiled politely the same way I had smiled my entire life when my presence made people uncomfortable for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. "Of course," I said. So I wore a navy blue dress, simple, clean lines, no badge, no insignia, no indication of who I was or what I had done. I didn't wear my service ring. I left my medal pin inside its velvet box in my suitcase. Not even a wristwatch. Just a small pair of pearl earrings my grandmother had once given me. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give Grace credit, she knows how to curate a moment. The white silk tent glowed with fairy lights. The vows were handwritten, delivered with just enough quiver in her voice to draw tears from the front row. Andrew looked every bit the golden boy in his tailored tux, promising forever. I clapped like everyone else, took a glass of Prosecco from a passing server, and followed the crowd into the reception hall. I had been seated unsurprisingly at the far corner, again table 14. The same one from the rehearsal dinner. The place where people with no clear role or social advantage were placed. But I didn't mind. I was used to being set aside. The food came and went. Plated sea bass, chilled asparagus, lemon tart with meringue. People mingled, laughed, posted their perfectly posed photos online. And then the mic came on. The maid of honor stood. She wore dusty rose chiffon and too much perfume and smiled like she knew she was about to deliver the highlight of the night. Her speech was lighthearted, predictable. Childhood stories about Grace sneaking makeup from their mother's bathroom. Inside jokes from college. A brief pause for a dramatic sip of champagne. And of course, there's Grace's big sister Elena. Always the dependable one. Always so Serious. We never quite knew what she did we? Something in government. I think I've heard she works in some office in D.C. Maybe as a clerk or something. Laughter. Scattered at first, then more as people caught the punchline. A few turned their heads toward me. Someone giggled into their wine glass. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I simply took a sip from my glass and let the moment pass through me like wind. I've endured things far harsher than social mockery. But I saw it. Andrew's face changed. From across the room at the center table under the chandelier, his head turned slightly in my direction. His brow furrowed. His eyes narrowed not in judgment, but in realization. He leaned over to his best man, a man in dress blues with a tight haircut and the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd served. They exchanged a few words. The best man's eyes widened. He looked directly at me. The mood around their table shifted. Andrew sat up straighter, eyes still locked on mine. Then slowly, carefully, he pushed back his chair. I watched him navigate the crowd, weaving through guests, still chuckling from the speech. When he reached my table, his voice dropped low. "Ma'am, I have to ask, are you Lieutenant General Elena Thompson?" I didn't answer right away. He blinked. His voice trembled almost in awe. "Polaris Task Force, the Multinational Rapid Response Unit." Someone near us gasped. The best man had followed and now stood to Andrew's right, eyes wide with recognition. The bride's older sister, suddenly not just a background character. "I read about you," Andrew said softly. "Your name came up in a briefing last month. You coordinated the Takar evacuation, didn't you?" I set my wineglass down, straightened my spine, met his gaze. I did. Silence. The kind that doesn't feel empty but full. Behind us, the music had stopped. A ripple of whispers moved through the room like a current under still water. Someone nearby murmured, "General." Another, "She's 3 stars." The air changed. People who had once looked through me were now looking at me like I had materialized out of myth. Grace hadn't noticed yet. She was smiling for photos near the cake, unaware that the center of gravity in her wedding had just shifted by degrees. Andrew took a half step back, then nodded with the kind of respect men reserve for those who've earned it the hard way. And just like that, the invisible woman became the most visible person in the room. I didn't ask for it. I didn't need it. But in that moment, the silence I had carried my whole life finally broke itself open without me saying a word. I hadn't moved from my chair. My wineglass sat half full, a fine condensation ring forming on the white linen. I could feel the eyes now scattered at first, then gathering, collecting on me like magnets, drawn to something they didn't expect to find. From the periphery, a man in a dark navy suit made his way through the crowd with quiet certainty. He walked like someone used to access, like someone who had once stood in briefing rooms, not ballrooms. When he reached my table, he extended his hand. "Lieutenant General Thompson," he said, voice low but reverent. "I had the honor of attending your 2019 address at the Pentagon. You spoke about cross-agency coordination in multinational crisis zones. It changed how we approached everything in Eastern Africa." I recognized him now, Richard Calloway, former National Security Advisor under President Langston. We'd never spoken, but I had seen his face in enough secure briefings to know this wasn't a man easily impressed. "It's an honor to meet you in person," he added. "Truly." A few heads turned to watch our exchange. The whispers that had once been ripples had now become waves. Across the room, I saw a man, Grace's boss, if I remembered correctly, rise slowly from his seat. He nodded to me, then sat back down, his expression unreadable. Another guest stood, then another. And suddenly, as if some unspoken protocol had kicked in, several men in military or former service backgrounds stood upright at their tables, not in salute, but in something close to it. It was quiet, not tense, just still. Until I heard Grace's voice behind me. "Wait! What's going on?" I turned. She was standing there in her gown bouquet, still in hand, her hair softly curled around her face. She looked confused, maybe even a little embarrassed. Why is everyone acting weird? What did I miss? Andrew stepped beside her. His hand rested lightly on her lower back, as if bracing her. "She's not a clerk, Grace," he said gently. "Your sister's a lieutenant general, a 3-star general." Grace blinked, laughed. "What? No. That's not Elena." "Seriously?" Her voice rose just slightly in pitch, a defense mechanism she'd had since we were kids. Whenever reality didn't line up with what she wanted to believe, she'd laugh. Shrug. Call it ridiculous. I stood slowly. Not dramatically, just stood. "It's true," Andrew added, turning to her. She led Polaris. She's been in active military leadership for over 20 years. Grace looked at me like I had betrayed her, like I had hidden something on purpose. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" she said almost accusingly. I looked at her calm and measured. "I didn't hide anything," I said softly. "You just never asked." There was no venom in my voice, no edge, just the quiet weight of years of being overlooked. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Behind her, I noticed her friends, the ones who had laughed earlier, sitting in uneasy silence now. One of them took out her phone. I saw my name typed into a search bar. Then, the look of realization bloom across her face. I looked around the room and saw 100 different versions of the same expression: regret, embarrassment, awe, and a growing, burning shame. No one made eye contact anymore, at least not directly. It was funny. I had spent my entire adult life commanding respect from soldiers, diplomats, even foreign heads of state. But it took one careless joke from a maid of honor and the stunned recognition of a groom for this room to finally see me. And yet I didn't feel triumphant, just resolved. I turned back to Richard Calloway and extended my hand. "Thank you for remembering that speech," I said. "Not many people do." He smiled. "Some things are hard to forget." Grace was still standing there frozen. Her perfect day, crafted from monogrammed menus and curated floral palettes, was suddenly off script. And it wasn't because I had done anything. It was because for once I hadn't shrunk myself to fit her world. I had simply existed. Fully. Honestly. And that was enough to shake the walls. The first time I realized I might die was in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, in the spring of 2010. I was a young major back then, just shy of 30 on my 3rd deployment, and commanding a forward operating unit of 67 soldiers. We were embedded in one of the most volatile sectors of the region, where the lines between civilian insurgent and terrain could shift in a single breath. That night the air was sharp with dust and tension. We'd received intel that a nearby Taliban cell was preparing to hit a nearby supply route, so we had split the company. I sent 41 of my men and women to reinforce the Western Ridge Standard Protocol. But we didn't anticipate the second wave or the IED buried near the return path, cutting them off from the main base. The enemy closed in fast mortars from the hill's sniper fire from a dried-out canal and no air support in range. Radios were patchy. Every line buzzed with static or panic. I remember kneeling in the operations tent map lit by red light, trying to calculate time terrain and probability like they were parts of a solvable equation. But war doesn't care about equations. The only thing standing between the trapped squad and being overrun was an old fuel depot barely 2 clicks from their position, just enough cover to draw enemy fire, but also an instant firestorm waiting to happen. I had 2 options. 1. Hold and hope reinforcements made it in time. 2. Blow the depot sky high and use the chaos to extract the unit. But blowing the depot meant destroying our only fuel line for the next 3 weeks. It meant disrupting regional operations and triggering an inquiry from command. It meant owning the consequences if the blast went wrong and killed the very people I was trying to save. I had 15 minutes to decide. I took 5. Detonate the fuel depot, I told my lieutenant. Time the blast to the convoy's movement. Pull them out while the enemy ducks for cover. The young comms officer paled. "Ma'am, command's not going to like that." "Then I'll give them someone to blame," I replied. "Now move." The explosion was so loud it shook the mountains. Flames danced against the night sky like vengeful ghosts. But it worked. All 41 made it out alive. 1 with a fractured leg, 2 with minor shrapnel wounds, No fatalities. The Taliban scattered in the confusion, and we held the ridge. The inquiry came 2 days later, as expected. I was called into the green tent, 4 men and 1 woman, all ranking above me, all with stern faces and folders thicker than necessary. They grilled me for hours. Why didn't you wait for orders? Do you realize the operational cost of that depot? You jeopardized weeks of strategic planning? I answered calmly. Factually. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I just said I chose 41 lives over 40,000 gallons of fuel. If you disagree with that equation, I accept the consequences. They didn't court-martial me. They gave me the Silver Star. And 3 years later, when my name came up for promotion, one of the generals in that tent recommended me for Brigadier General, not because I played it safe, but because I didn't. That moment, that fire, that impossible choice was the crucible that forged the officer I became. Every promotion since, every command I've held, every classified directive I've written stems from that night. From a single moment of clarity in the dark, when I realized leadership wasn't about approval, it was about weight, and I've carried it ever since. I became a 3-star general in 2021, one of only 3 active-duty female lieutenant generals in the U.S. Armed Forces at the time. I was offered a press release, an official ceremony, media interviews. I declined them all. Not out of shame, but because the only people who needed to know already knew. I never wore my stars outside uniform. Never corrected people when they guessed I worked in admin or logistics. Because I learned long ago that titles mean nothing to those who don't care who you are, and everything to those who do. So when my mother asked me not to wear my uniform to Grace's wedding, I didn't argue. She thought she was protecting the mood. She didn't know she was hiding the quietest war hero in the room. And I let her. Because it's not validation I'm after. It never has been. The string lights outside the reception tent glowed soft and golden, swaying slightly in the warm evening breeze. Music and laughter still floated in the air, but it sounded distant now, muted, like it belonged to someone else's celebration. Grace grabbed my wrist as I stepped out onto the stone path behind the garden. Her grip was tighter than expected. "We need to talk. Now." I let her lead. Her heels clicked angrily on the flagstones, her white train trailing behind like a ghost. We stopped behind a row of hedges, just far enough away from the party to be unheard. She turned to face me, cheeks flushed not from joy, but from fury. "You ruined my wedding," she snapped. I said nothing. "You couldn't just let me have today. Could you? You had to make it about you." Still, I didn't speak. Her words hung in the air between us, brittle and shaking. "They're all talking about you now. The groom's side, the press people, even Dad. All anyone sees is you. My wedding became your military moment." I looked at her, my expression unreadable. She huffed, arms crossed, bouquet still clutched in one hand like a prop she'd forgotten to set down. "You always do this, Elena. Always. Even when you don't try, you find a way to overshadow me. You make me feel so damn small." There it was, the truth raw and unfiltered. I took a slow breath. "Grace," I said softly but firmly, "no one makes you feel small, except you." She blinked, caught off guard. Not by the words, but by the calm behind them. "That's not true." "It is," I continued. I sat quietly. I said nothing. "I wore the dress you asked. I didn't bring rank or title or uniform into your day. Someone else mentioned me. Someone else asked the question. I just existed." Her lip quivered. She turned away, hugging her arms to her chest. "But you always take up space, Elena. Even when you say nothing. That's not my fault." There was a long pause, the kind where old truths creep in through the silence. "You know," I said gently, "for most of my life I've made myself smaller. So you could feel bigger. I let you be the favorite. The loudest. The brightest." I stepped back. I shrank. I never once corrected anyone who misunderstood what I do, because I didn't want you to feel outshined. I stepped closer. Not aggressively, just close enough for her to hear what I wouldn't repeat. But I won't apologize for who I am. Not anymore. Her eyes welled, but she blinked the tears away fast, too proud to let them fall. You don't get it, she whispered. You were always the strong one. The smart one. The one who didn't need anything from anyone. I had to be the pretty one, the likable one. I had to keep everyone smiling. I softened. Grace, you were never just that. You're creative. You have heart. People gravitate to you for a reason. But your shine was never dimmed by mine. We could have both existed fully. You just didn't want to see me for what I was. Silence again. From the distance, we could hear the music pick back up. Someone inside was laughing, probably Andrew, probably pretending this all hadn't happened. Grace stared down at the gravel path. So what now, she asked. Now I exhaled. Now you go back in and finish your wedding, smile, dance, live the life you wanted. And I go back to mine. She looked up. For a moment, there was something in her eyes that resembled the girl I once shared a bedroom with, the girl who cried after watching Mulan and whispered that she wanted to be brave too. But she said nothing. And neither did I. We walked back separately, her through the roses, me through the shadows. No screaming, no drama, just truth. Finally spoken. I had just returned to my seat, hoping to finish the glass of wine I'd abandoned earlier, when a familiar presence approached Andrew's father. He was taller up close, broad-shouldered despite age softening his frame, with that unmistakable upright posture you never quite lose after years in uniform. I'd noticed the telltale signs earlier, the sharpness of his eyes, the way he scanned a room before sitting, the quiet respect he commanded without ever saying a word. He stopped beside me, gently cleared his throat, and said, "Lieutenant General Thompson, ma'am. I served 22 years in the Marine Corps. May I shake your hand?" I rose instinctively and extended mine. "It's an honor, sir." But he shook his head, half smiling. No, the honor's mine. My boys in the Corps used to talk about Polaris like it was legend. I never thought I'd meet the woman behind it, especially not here in a tent full of wedding planners and gluten-free canapes. We both chuckled, the first lightness I'd felt all evening. He hesitated, then added more earnestly, "Would you mind if we took a photo together? I'd like to show my old unit who I had the privilege of meeting." I nodded. Of course. We took the photo just outside the tent. Nothing posed or grand, just two former officers standing side by side, the unspoken bond of service in the air between us. After that, the energy around me shifted again. One by one, guests began to approach, no longer with curiosity, but with deference. A woman in a tailored black suit slipped me her card, whispering, "I work with the Homeland Security Advisory Council. We'd be honored to have your insights in our next closed-door session." Another gentleman, a senior defense analyst if memory served, told me I had been the subject of discussion in last year's NATO symposium. He spoke to me like a peer, like a leader. I wasn't used to being recognized in civilian clothes, but now I could feel the shift, not in how people looked at me, but in how they stood around me. Friends of Andrew men who had earlier joked about fantasy football and IPOs suddenly grew stiff when I passed their table. Their voices dropped. One even rose from his chair when I walked by, almost as if his body moved before his brain caught up. The casual confidence they wore like cufflinks earlier in the evening had been replaced by something else. Respect, restraint, and maybe, just maybe, a little discomfort. Not because I had asked for it, but because I had done nothing to seek their approval, and yet commanded it anyway. Somewhere near the bar, I caught the maid of honor watching me. She was no longer laughing. And Grace. She was on the dance floor, surrounded by bridesmaids trying to keep the spotlight firmly in her orbit. But even she knew it had already shifted. Not because I stole it, but because I stood in it, finally. Dinner had ended. The sun had dipped fully below the trees, and the fairy lights above us glowed warmer, softer. Somewhere off to the side, the band was resetting for the final round of dancing. Guests were full of wine, dessert, and murmurs. The MC tapped his mic and with a cheerful tone said, "Before we wrap up with a final dance, we have one more toast to give. The bride's sister, Lieutenant Thompson, has kindly agreed to say a few words." There was a flicker, almost imperceptible, on Grace's face. Her smile strained just a little. She hadn't asked me to speak. Someone else had, likely Andrew. Still, she nodded politely, as if giving her blessing to something she could no longer control. I stood slowly, not to make a scene, not to take space, just because it was time. The room quieted before I said a word. I walked to the mic in my simple navy blue dress, still no medals, no titles, no announcement, just myself. I took a breath, let the stillness settle around me, and then I began. "I'm Elena, Grace's older sister." A few heads nodded. A few others still watching me like I might shift into someone else at any moment. Growing up, Grace was the radiant one, the joyful one, the one who could make a room feel lighter just by walking in. And I was the quiet one. I kept to myself. I followed rules. I didn't demand attention. I paused, glancing toward my sister. She was still smiling, tightly. For a long time I believed that what I did didn't matter to this family, that as long as I stayed out of the way, kept things running, and didn't ask for recognition, that was enough. A beat. I didn't wear my uniform today because I was asked not to. I didn't bring my rank or my record or the years of service behind me. I didn't need to. That's not why I'm here. People leaned in now, curious, tense, listening. I came today not as a soldier, not as a general, not even as a public servant. I came as a sister, a daughter, a guest. I looked out over the room at the guests who once saw me as a blurry background figure, at those who now stood straighter when I walked past, at those who still didn't know how to reconcile what I was with what they'd assumed. You know, for most of my life, I thought that to be seen, I had to prove something. That if I wanted to be recognized, I needed titles or medals or clearances or war stories. But tonight, I learned something else. My voice softened. The people who truly see you don't need your resume. They don't need your job title. They don't need you to explain yourself. I looked at Grace. They just look at you and know. The room was absolutely silent now. No clinking of glasses, no whispering, just breath. "Grace," I said gently, "you have always had a way of making the world feel warmer. And despite our differences, I've always admired that about you. I wish you and Andrew a marriage filled with the kind of courage it takes to see someone really see them, even when it's easier not to." I paused, just long enough. "Thank you for letting me be part of this day. It's one I'll never forget." I stepped back from the microphone. For a moment, no one moved. No one blinked. And then applause. It wasn't polite. It wasn't obligatory. It was real, slow then growing, like something blooming, like air finally rushing back into a space that had been starved of oxygen. Someone stood, then another. Even Andrew's father, the Marine, gave a single sharp nod. I didn't look at Grace again. I didn't need to, because the truth had been spoken, and for the first time in my life, they heard me. The house I stayed in that night was a small guest cottage on the far end of the estate. Quiet, tucked under old oak trees with creaking wood floors and a single lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. I was still in my dress, still barefoot. I hadn't taken off the pearl earrings. It was past midnight when my phone rang. Unlisted number, DC area code. I already knew who it was before I answered. "Lieutenant General Thompson," a voice said, brisk but respectful. "Apologies for the late hour. This is Colonel Davison from the Joint Chiefs Office. You've been requested to accompany the President on a diplomatic tour through the Asia-Pacific region. Defense cooperation briefings, multi-agency coordination. You come highly recommended and highly requested." I leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed. When do we leave wheels up in 72 hours, ma'am? Final clearance pending your confirmation. You have it. Understood. Uniform code will be formal. Full dress requested for summit receptions. Copy that. We hung up. I sat there for a moment letting it sink in. Not the news, but the timing. They had no idea I'd just come from a wedding where I was mistaken for a clerk. I stood up and walked to the modest travel trunk I'd brought with me. Opened it slowly. Inside, folded with reverence, was my Army blue service uniform. Polished insignia, crisp creases. My 3 silver stars gleamed even in the low light. I hadn't worn it in weeks. Not for the ceremony, not for Grace. But Washington had called. And Washington knew exactly who I was. I smiled. Not the smile of triumph, but the quiet one that comes when the world stops trying to shrink you because it finally realizes it can't. The next morning, my phone was full. 32 unread messages, 11 voicemails, a few missed calls from numbers I recognized. Cousins, an aunt, a college friend of Grace's, even one of her bridesmaids. Most of the messages were versions of the same thing. I had no idea. Why didn't you ever say something? You were incredible last night. Thank you for your service. I didn't reply to any of them. Some things don't need a response. Then, my mother's name flashed on the screen. She hadn't called, just a text. Elena, I'm sorry for not understanding you, for not asking more, for not seeing. I was wrong. I stared at the message for a long time, not because it shocked me, but because it didn't feel like enough. For years, I had carried the weight of being invisible in my own family. I had buried my achievements so deep just to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. I had watched Grace get celebrated for being pretty and pleasant while I led combat missions in silence. A single text couldn't erase that. I locked the phone, set it face down on the table. Later that day, I checked Grace's social media out of curiosity. The wedding photos were up, sun-drenched shots, her in her gown, Andrew kissing her forehead, cake, candids, hashtags. There was no mention of my speech, not even a photo of us together. It was as if I had never stood at that microphone, as if that moment of truth had been clipped away, edited like a blemish. I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just the steady confirmation of what I already knew. Some people will never be able to hold your full story, and that's okay. Because I'm not living for their approval anymore. Let them crop me out. Let them revise the story. The people who matter now, the ones who serve beside me, who follow my lead, who trust me in boardrooms and war zones, they know exactly who I am. And that's more than enough. A few days after the wedding, I found myself alone in a quiet cabin outside Colorado Springs. A place I'd rented before deployments, small, simple, surrounded by tall pines, and silence thick enough to breathe. That morning, I sat at the old oak table with a pen in hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of me. I hadn't written anything personal in years. Orders, yes, briefings daily, but feelings rarely. Still, something in me needed release, not to send, not to confront, just to say it out loud on the page. I addressed it to both of them. Dear Mom, dear Grace, there were so many moments in my life when I wondered what I did wrong. I used to watch the way your eyes lit up for Grace, how you'd gush about her dresses, her boyfriends, her career, even when she barely tried. And I kept wondering, what was wrong with me? Why didn't I deserve the same softness, the same applause? I studied hard. I served my country. I led men into fire and brought them home. And yet all I ever seemed to be to you was too much, too serious, too cold, too hard to love. But here's what I've come to understand. It wasn't that you didn't love me. It's that you didn't know how to love a woman like me. I didn't fit the mold. I wasn't delicate. I didn't cry easily. I didn't need to be protected. And because I didn't need your approval to survive, you assumed I didn't want your affection either. You saw my strength and mistook it for distance. You saw my silence and thought it meant I had nothing to say. But I felt everything. Every time I was overlooked. Every time my accomplishments were brushed aside. Every time I was made small to make space for grace. I've carried those wounds for years, quietly with dignity. But they were real. And yet, I don't hate you. That surprised me honestly. I don't carry anger toward you anymore. I don't resent the birthday cards you forgot, or the phone calls that never came. I don't even resent the fact that Grace erased my speech from her wedding post. Because somewhere along the line, I learned this truth. You can't ask people to love you in ways they were never taught. I forgive you, not because you asked for it, but because I'm done letting that pain define me. But here's what I also know. Forgiveness is not the same as return. I'm not coming back. Not to the smallness, not to the role you once carved out for me. I won't keep knocking on doors that were never meant to open. You don't have to apologize again. You don't have to make it right. I just needed to say this. For me. Not for you. With quiet love, Elena, I stared at the letter for a long time. Then I folded it, walked outside, and set it in the cast-iron fire pit beside the porch. I struck a match, watched the edges curl, dark, and vanish. I didn't feel release or power, just peace. There was something honest about flames. They don't argue, they don't rewrite history. They just take what's given and turn it into light. The smoke curled into the morning air, dancing up between the trees. It was gone, but not forgotten. And neither was I. It started with a single article, not from a tabloid or a gossip blog, but from The Sentinel, a respected defense and intelligence magazine known for publishing stories that never make the nightly news. The headline was clean, understated, but impossible to ignore. The anonymous woman at $1 million wedding. Turns out she's Lieutenant General Thompson. They didn't use clickbait. They didn't need to. The piece was written by a former military journalist who had apparently attended the wedding as a guest, an uncle of Andrew's, I would later learn. He'd recognized my face the moment the whispers started that night and had gone home to double-check what his instincts already told him. The article described the event from his point of view, a lavish wedding in Virginia. A quiet woman in navy blue. A throwaway joke in a speech that backfired in the most spectacular way. And then, the reveal. My service record. My leadership of the Polaris Task Force. My status as one of only a handful of active-duty female 3-star generals in American history. It was thoughtful, respectful, clear, and it went viral within 12 hours. By the next morning, my inbox was flooded with press inquiries. My name trended for a brief moment on military Twitter. Think tanks and leadership forums reposted the article with captions like, "Strength doesn't always wear a name tag. She didn't crash the wedding, she just happened to be the most decorated person in the room." I turned down every personal interview, politely. I wasn't interested in becoming a headline, but I did accept one invitation, a keynote appearance at the National Women in Command Summit. That morning I walked across the stage in full uniform. No one mispronounced my name. No one asked what I did in D.C. They stood when I entered. They listened when I spoke. I didn't talk about the wedding. I talked about silence, about strength, about the decades women spend being told to sit down, quiet down, be less, and what happens when we don't. The applause that followed wasn't the loudest I'd ever heard, but it was the most earned. Back in Virginia, Grace had a different week. 3 days after the article was published, she took down her Facebook profile. The comments on her wedding photos had shifted from compliments on her dress to subtle, pointed questions. "Was that really your sister? Why didn't anyone mention her speech? This is the woman from the Polaris article, right?" She didn't respond. She just disappeared. And for once, I didn't rush to soften the impact. Didn't send a message. Didn't offer cover. Because the truth had always been there. They had just chosen not to see it. And now the world had looked and finally saw. Outside, snow was falling in soft, steady curtains. The kind that silenced the world and made even time feel like it was holding its breath. From the window of my small wooden cabin in Colorado, I could see the white blanketing the pines, tucking the earth in for a long rest. Inside, everything was quiet, peaceful. I moved slowly, deliberately, no rush, no demands. I placed the kettle on the old iron stove and waited for it to hum. A familiar ritual, one I'd come to cherish in the months since stepping back from active command. At my feet, my dog Bo, a 12-year-old golden retriever with cloudy eyes and a wise old soul, lay curled on the rug. I reached down to stroke his fur, his breath slow and steady against my hand. This, I thought, is what freedom feels like. Not medals, not promotions, but stillness. A life lived on your own terms. The phone rang. Not loudly, just a gentle vibration and soft ringtone that echoed in the quiet room. I almost didn't answer, but something nudged me too. General Thompson. The voice was young, nervous, but full of fire. "Yes," I said, sitting down slowly in the old armchair by the fire. "Ma'am, this is Lieutenant Ana Ramirez. We met at the Polaris debrief in Seoul last year. You probably don't remember." "Of course I do, Lieutenant," I interrupted, smiling. "You were the only one who challenged the data model in the logistics report." She laughed, relief in her voice. "Yes, ma'am. That was me. Congratulations on the promotion, Anna." There was a pause. Then softly they gave me captain. I wasn't sure I'd get it, but I did. And I wanted to call and say thank you. I leaned back. Bo shifted against my feet. "Why thank me?" "Because—" She hesitated, then continued. "You've been my North Star. Ever since I read about your command in Helmand. The decisions you made, the way you carried yourself. You made me believe I could lead too. And I hope it's not weird to say this, but you're kind of my military mom." That made me chuckle. A soft, warm sound I hadn't heard from myself in a while. "Not weird at all, Captain. It's an honor." She exhaled. We exchanged a few more words, quick updates, future plans, encouragements before she hung up. I set the phone down on the table beside me. Outside, the snow was still falling. Inside, the tea kettle began to sing. And in that moment, I felt something settle in me. Something whole. Something finished. I had spent a lifetime walking tightropes between pride and humility, strength and silence, visibility and invisibility. I had carried titles and expectations and heartbreak. I had been a daughter unseen, a sister misunderstood, a leader judged from afar. But here now, in the quiet of my own life, I no longer needed anyone's approval. Not Grace's, not my mother's, not the strangers who had once laughed at a speech line meant to belittle me. I had done what I came to do, and I had done it with integrity. I poured my tea, steam curling into the air like a final chapter writing itself. As I sat back watching the snow fall beyond the window, I thought about how strange life is, how sometimes the person no one notices becomes the one others look to for direction. How the quietest voice can echo the longest. How a woman once written off as just a clerk could lead nations and still choose peace over recognition. I didn't need the applause anymore. I didn't need the spotlight, because I had earned something far greater respect. And not the kind that comes with medals or articles or salutes, but the kind that lives in whispered gratitude, in young officers calling you mom, in the way the world slowly, finally, learns your name. And in that final thought, I found what I had been looking for all along. Not permission, not validation, but the quiet, powerful truth. The woman they thought had been forgotten was the one they're all learning how to honor.